A dried piece of crocodile dung sits inside a stone mortar. A bronze pestle crushes the waste into a fine, dark powder. A handful of sticky, fermented dough is folded into the mixture. The paste is shaped into a small, dense cylinder. A woman in 1850 BCE Egypt inserts this pessary into her body. She is not performing a ritual, she is practicing medicine. This was the reality of ancient birth control. It was a desperate chemical gamble against the biology of the Nile. The Kahun Gynecological Papyrus, dating to roughly 1850 BCE, remains the earliest medical record of human fertility control. It provided explicit instructions for the creation of vaginal suppositories. The ingredients were often as shocking as they were specific. Archaeologists and historians have scrutinized these texts for over a century. The primary goal was the creation of a barrier. The Egyptians sought to block the path of conception through physical and chemical means. Another ancient document, the Ebers Papyrus, appeared around 1550 BCE. It offered a more refined, if still complex, recipe for a contraceptive. Practitioners ground acacia tips into a paste with bitter apple and dates. They added honey to the mixture to ensure consistency. This was not merely folk superstition. Modern chemical analysis has revealed the science hidden within these ancient preparations. Acacia gum naturally ferments into lactic acid. Lactic acid is a potent, documented spermicide. When applied as a suppository, it created a hostile environment for sperm. The Egyptians did not understand the biological mechanics of the germ theory, yet they successfully engineered a chemical barrier that functioned with surprising accuracy. The reality was that these women possessed a functional, if rudimentary, medical technology. The environment of the Nile floodplains necessitated these interventions. Medical practitioners of the era recognized the physical toll of frequent childbirth. They recorded their findings on papyrus scrolls that survived for millennia. These documents represent the intersection of survival and early pharmacology. The Egyptians were the first to document the attempt to separate pleasure from reproduction. Their methods were born from the necessity of managing family size in a harsh landscape. But to understand why these methods persisted for centuries, you must look at the transition from crude barriers to the legendary plants of the Mediterranean. A golden coin from the city of Cyrene sits on a velvet tray. The image stamped into the metal shows the stalk of a plant. This was the plant called Silphium. It grew only in a narrow, arid strip of land in North Africa. It was the most valuable commodity in the ancient Mediterranean world. The Roman poet Catullus wrote of his desire to kiss his lover as many times as there were grains of sand in Cyrene. He placed those kisses alongside the Silphium harvest. The plant was a status symbol for the wealthy. But its value was not merely culinary. The physician Soranus of Ephesus documented its use as a powerful contraceptive. Soranus of Ephesus lived in the 2nd century. He categorized Silphium as both a preventative and an abortifacient. Women consumed a pea-sized amount of the resin to prevent pregnancy. The demand for the plant was absolute. Traders sold it for its weight in silver denarii. The plant defied every attempt at domestication. It refused to grow outside its native habitat in modern-day Libya. Farmers tried to cultivate the soil in Greece and Italy. The seeds failed to sprout in foreign earth. The entire supply relied on the wild harvest from the Cyrenian hills. Over-harvesting accelerated as the Roman Empire expanded. Shepherds grazed their flocks on the same hills where the plant grew. The animals ate the wild stalks faster than they could reproduce. The supply dwindled year after year. The botanical treasure began to vanish from the maps. Pliny the Elder recorded the final days of the species. He was a Roman naturalist and author. In his work, Naturalis Historia, he documented the ecological collapse. He noted that the plant had been missing from the region for years. The year was 77 CE. A single stalk of Silphium was found in the wild. It was the last one ever recorded by a contemporary historian. The Roman Emperor Nero received the stalk as a gift. He reportedly consumed the final remnant of the species. The extinction was complete. The most effective contraceptive in the ancient world was gone. Women lost access to a medicine that had been refined over centuries. The loss of Silphium marked a turning point in reproductive history. It forced practitioners to return to less reliable methods. But to understand the medical void this left behind, you need to see the clinical coldness of the methods that replaced it. Soranus of Ephesus moved beyond herbal remedies in his medical treatises. He looked toward the mechanical and the physical. He wrote of techniques that required no rare plants at all. He documented the reality of how women navigated their own biology. A heavy, leather-bound scroll rests on a wooden table in the Roman Empire. This is the 2nd century. The physician Soranus of Ephesus sits in his study. He writes his definitive medical text, titled Gynecology. He documents the physical realities of the human body with clinical precision. The text serves as the most comprehensive guide of the ancient world. Soranus of Ephesus rejects the reliance on rare, extinct plants like Silphium. He turns his attention to the mechanical and biological realities of the cervix. The physician details methods that require no external medicine. He describes the practice of post-coital sneezing as a preventative measure. The woman stands immediately after intercourse to clear the internal passage. She holds her breath during the moment of ejaculation to alter internal pressure. These techniques reflect a deep, if limited, understanding of human anatomy. But to understand why these methods persisted, you must see the chemistry of the cervix. Soranus of Ephesus advocates for the application of acidic substances. He instructs practitioners to use pomegranate rind or alum. These substances are applied directly to the cervix. The goal is to alter the vaginal pH to a more acidic state. This creates a hostile environment for sperm survival. The Roman medical community treats these methods as standard practice. This is not magic or superstition. It is the application of early, documented physiological knowledge. The reality was a constant negotiation between biology and intent. Women followed these instructions to manage their own fertility. The methods required no rare ingredients or expensive trade goods. They relied on the physical properties of common household items. The physician records these observations for future generations of practitioners. His work remains the primary authority on female health for centuries. But the shift from simple chemistry to mechanical intervention was already underway. The ancient world was slowly reaching the limits of its own biological understanding. The transition would eventually lead to the invention of physical barriers. This was the documented history of the ancient human struggle for control. A vellum manuscript lies open on a wooden desk in 12th century Italy. The text is the Trotula. It remains the only comprehensive medical guide from the Middle Ages to address women's health. The work is attributed to the practitioner Trota of Salerno. She operated within the walls of the medical school at Salerno. It was the only institution in Europe at the time that admitted women as both students and teachers. The pages detail recipes for herbal concoctions. The ingredients are specific and grounded in botanical tradition. Practitioners mixed willow, mugwort, and rue into teas and poultices. These were the tools used to manage fertility. The text bridges the gap between ancient medical logic and medieval folk practice. But to understand the reality of this era, you must see the overlap between science and belief. The Trotula catalogs these herbal recipes alongside the use of magical amulets. A small, worn leather pouch hangs from a belt in a dimly lit room. The pouch contains dried herbs intended to ward off conception. The medical community of the 12th century did not always separate the two. Herbal knowledge flowed through the hands of women in secret. It was a shared network of information. It bypassed the formal influence of the church. The recipes were tested through generations of lived experience. The effectiveness of these herbs varied widely. Some acted as mild emmenagogues. Others functioned primarily as placeholders in a world with few options. The reality was that women navigated their own biology through this inherited knowledge. They did not look to grand institutions for permission. They looked to the plants growing in the local fields. The Trotula documented this underground economy of health. It preserved the wisdom of those who practiced in the shadows of the cathedral. The manuscript remains a testament to a time when medical authority was contested. The history of fertility control was written in these recipes. It was a history passed from woman to woman in the quiet corners of the medieval world. A leather-bound volume of the Bible sits open on a stone lectern. The Catholic Church solidified its stance on reproductive control during this era. The doctrine relied heavily on the biblical account of Onan in Genesis 38:9. Church leaders cited the narrative as a divine prohibition against non-procreative acts. But the reality of daily life in the 18th century told a different story. Demographic data reveals a sharp disconnect between pulpit rhetoric and private action. The French demographer Louis Henry studied birth registers from this period with meticulous care. He analyzed the falling birth rates across the rural provinces of 18th-century France. His research uncovered a consistent pattern that defied official religious mandates. Families were clearly limiting the number of children they brought into the world. They did not rely on the sanctioned methods of the Church. The primary technique for population control was the ancient practice of coitus interruptus. But to understand how this persisted, you need to look at the physical record. Physical barriers emerged as a secondary, more specialized solution for the elite. In 1564, the Italian anatomist Gabriele Falloppio published his medical work De Morbo Gallico. He described a sheath made of linen soaked in a chemical solution. The device was not intended as a contraceptive for the general population. Falloppio designed this linen sheath specifically to prevent the transmission of syphilis. The material was intended to act as a barrier against the spread of infection. It was a clinical response to a medical crisis, not a tool for social engineering. The reality was that most people navigated their fertility without such specialized inventions. They relied on the methods that were accessible and required no external purchase. Louis Henry confirmed that the decline in fertility was a deliberate, widespread choice. The Church continued to preach against the practice from every altar in Europe. The parishioners continued to ignore the prohibition in the privacy of their homes. This tension defined the reproductive history of the 18th century. It was a quiet, persistent defiance of institutional control. The records of the era leave no doubt about the discrepancy. The official doctrine demanded total submission to divine procreative will. The demographic evidence shows that individuals chose their own path instead. The linen sheath remained a rare clinical object for the wealthy or the cautious. The common practice remained hidden, undocumented in the eyes of the Church, but visible in the numbers. The history of the human body was written in the gap between these two worlds. A weathered midwifery manual from 17th-century England lies open on a scarred wooden table. The pages are stained with damp and frequent handling. Lists of herbal emmenagogues fill the margins in faded, cramped script. Pennyroyal and Savin appear as the primary recommendations for a missed monthly cycle. Midwives passed these recipes down through generations of rural communities. They were intended to induce uterine contractions when a pregnancy was suspected. The botanical logic was ancient, but the application was dangerously imprecise. Toxicological reports from the 19th century later detailed the grim reality of these doses. The line between a medicinal remedy and a lethal toxin was razor thin. Women often ingested quantities that caused systemic organ failure before any other result. Liver damage and internal hemorrhaging were common side effects of these desperate measures. The plants were not merely ineffective, they were frequently fatal. This was the documented cost of managing fertility in the pre-industrial era. The state eventually intervened in the private sphere of the home. The British Parliament passed the Ellenborough Act in the year 1803. This legislation marked a sharp departure from earlier common law traditions. It was the first law to specifically criminalize abortion after the point of quickening. The state claimed authority over the biological processes of the individual. The era of whispered herbal knowledge and underground practice began to vanish. Legal statutes replaced the traditional, informal networks of the village midwife. The shift moved reproductive health from the kitchen to the courtroom. The 1803 Act established a precedent for state-mandated control of the body. You think you are looking at a closed chapter of history, but you are standing in the exact same gap between official law and private necessity. The cycle of desperate choices and state oversight has never actually stopped. You are living in the echo of their silence, and the walls are closing in.